He came home, smelling like another woman's perfume, at 5 in the morning on Christmas Day. Dante Moretti, the man who made federal agents lose sleep, who buried 3 rivals in the same calendar year, who sat at the head of the most feared criminal organization in New York, walked through the doors of his 53rd floor penthouse with champagne still drying on his shirt collar and lipstick on the inside of his wrist where he'd missed it wiping down. He was already preparing the lie before he hit the elevator. He didn't need to. His wife wasn't asleep. She was sitting in the dark, in a chair she'd pulled directly in front of the door, hands folded in her lap, 7 months pregnant, completely still, and the look on her face wasn't the devastated, red-eyed look of a woman who'd been crying. It was worse than that. It was the look of a woman who had already made her decision. On the marble table beside her sat a single white envelope. If you've ever loved someone who treated your loyalty like a liability, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a man built entirely for power finally meets the one consequence he cannot outrun. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what comes next will shake you. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Christmas tree in the corner of the penthouse living room was still lit. Isabella had decorated it herself 3 weeks earlier, standing on a step stool with her belly in the way, laughing at herself when an ornament rolled under the couch and she couldn't bend far enough to retrieve it. She'd left it there. Dante had noticed it the next morning and said nothing, stepped over it, poured his coffee, and left. He remembered that now. He stood 6 feet from her in the foyer, coat still on, and the silence between them had a specific weight, not empty, not comfortable, but dense. The way silence gets when every possible sentence has already been considered, and most of them discarded. Isabella. He said her name the way he said most things, as a statement, not a question, as though simply identifying her presence would organize the situation. She didn't respond right away. She looked at him the way a doctor looks at a scan result, before deciding how to deliver the news. Measured, finished deciding. Close the door, she said. He closed it. She didn't stand, didn't reach for the envelope, didn't cry or raise her voice, or do any of the things Dante had quietly rehearsed responses to on the 40-minute ride back across the city, while Celeste Varela's perfume saturated the air of his town car. Where were you? Isabella said. It wasn't structured as a question. It was an inventory. She already knew, and she was giving him the opportunity to tell the truth, which they both understood he would not take. A meeting ran long. He moved toward the wet bar in the side room, needing something to do with his hands. Holiday complications with the Bellini situation. You know how December gets. I know exactly how December gets, she said. He poured 2 fingers of scotch he didn't want and turned back around. Isabella was still in the chair, still not looking at the envelope, still not doing any of the things that would have made this manageable. You're up late, he said. I'm up because our son has been kicking since midnight, and I couldn't sleep, and I had nothing to do except sit here and think about the fact that you've been at the Four Seasons on 57th Street with Celeste Varela since 8 o'clock last. She said it with the flatness of someone reading a weather report. East-facing suite, room 3114. Used the Bellini account to charge the room, which was clever, but Matteo's assistant processes those invoices, and she's been friendly with my housekeeper for 3 years. The scotch glass stayed halfway to his mouth, so Isabella adjusted her position in the chair, one hand moving to rest against the side of her belly in that unconscious gesture she'd developed in the last 2 months. I'd prefer you didn't insult either of us by continuing. Dante set the glass down. He'd been in rooms where men pulled guns. He'd sat across tables from people who wanted him dead and ordered dinner while they worked out the specifics of how to kill him. He had a particular talent, refined over 23 years, for not letting his face show what the inside of his chest was doing. That talent was not serving him at the moment. How long have you known, he said. Which part? The question landed like a step he hadn't realized was missing. Isabella finally reached for the envelope. She held it toward him, not set it on the floor between them, not through it, held it out, arm extended, with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment several times and decided exactly how she wanted it to look. It means, she said, that Celeste is not the first, and you should open that before you say anything else. Dante didn't cross the room immediately. He stood where he was for 3 full seconds, which was a long time for a man who processed situations the way he did in fractions, quickly, efficiently, moving from data to decision without the interference of sentiment. He crossed the room. He took the envelope. Inside were 4 documents, clipped separately. The first was a printed hotel invoice, with Celeste Varela's name on the second line, dated 11 times over the course of 14 months. The second was a series of photographs not intimate, but architectural. Celeste at the entrance to a building he used for private meetings, a shot of her car parked outside a restaurant he kept off public record, her speaking to a man Dante almost recognized before he turned the page. The third document was a 2-page summary he recognized immediately as the work of a private investigator, organized, clean, efficient, the kind of report that cost real money and came from someone who knew where to look. The fourth document was 23 pages. He knew what divorce papers looked like. He had read enough of them during discovery proceedings against rivals whose legitimate assets he'd helped dismantle through their family courts. He recognized the typography of the firm's header before he read the name, Vivian Cross J.D., at the top, and below it, in the language that converted a marriage into a contract breach, Isabella's name on one side and his on the other. "You filed," he said. "I retained her 6 weeks ago." Isabella's voice was the same, steady, quiet, without the performance of emotion that would have given him something to work with. "The filing happened yesterday morning. Christmas Eve seemed appropriate." He looked up from the papers. She met his eyes without flinching, and for a moment neither of them moved, and Dante Moretti had the specific and unfamiliar sensation of standing in a room where the power had already shifted before he'd noticed it moving. "You're 7 months pregnant," he said. "Yes, Isabella." "Don't," just that word, flat and final. "Don't do the voice. Don't do the thing where you say my name like you're explaining something complicated to someone who needs the simplified version. I'm not one of your people, Dante. I've never been one of your people. I've been your wife for 8 years, and I've protected this family, and I've managed relationships you didn't have the patience for, and I've absorbed every single time you chose the empire over me, and I have never once asked you to choose differently, because I understood what I married." Her hand moved again over her belly. "But I am not going to raise my son inside a lie, and I'm not going to let you look at him and teach him, without meaning to, that a woman's dignity is something you earn back with a good enough apology." He stood there with 23 pages of the end of his marriage in his hands, and could not, for the first time in longer than he could remember, identify the correct move. "Vivian Cross will destroy us both," he said finally. "She doesn't stop at the marriage. She pulls the thread and she keeps pulling. Everything I've built. I know exactly what Vivian Cross does." Isabella stood up slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a heavily pregnant woman who wasn't going to ask for help doing it. "I chose her for that reason. And before you tell me that threatens the organization, I want you to consider the fact that the organization is the reason we're standing here at 5 in the morning on Christmas while I'm carrying your child and your mistress is sleeping in a hotel on 57th Street. She moved past him toward the hallway without looking at him. "The guest suite is ready," she said without turning. "I had Maria prepare it 2 days ago. I think you should sleep there tonight, or wherever you prefer. I don't actually care." She was at the hallway entrance when he said it. "I'm not signing." Isabella stopped. She turned, slowly, and looked at him across the width of the living room, and the Christmas tree lights were still going. The little automated sequence Isabella had chosen warm white, slow pulse, and the unopened presents under it were still wrapped in the paper. She'd spent 2 hours picking out at the store on Madison, because she'd wanted this Christmas to feel like something. "You'll sign," she said, "because the alternative is Vivian Cross taking this to discovery, and I promise you the federal case that follows will be more expensive than anything I'm asking for." She paused. "I'm not trying to destroy you, Dante. I'm trying to leave you. Those aren't the same thing. But if you make the first one necessary to accomplish the second, I will." She left. He stood in the living room with the papers in his hand, the scotch going warm on the bar, and the lights pulsing slow and steady behind him, and for a very long time he didn't move at all. Matteo Bellini arrived at 9:30 that morning, with dark circles and coffee. He'd picked up from the place on Lex that Dante preferred 2 cups, which meant he already knew it was going to be a long conversation. He found Dante in the penthouse study, still in last night's clothes. The divorce papers spread across the desk in 4 separate groupings with the specificity of a man who had been reading the same documents repeatedly and finding new problems each time. "She filed with Cross," Dante said without looking up. Matteo set the coffees down. He pulled the chair across from the desk and sat with his elbows on his knees, the way he'd sat across from Dante in 100 different rooms during 100 different crises over the course of a 30-year friendship that had survived 3 regime changes, 2 federal investigations, and 1 very bad winter in 2019 that neither of them talked about anymore. "I heard," Matteo said, Dante looked up. How Cross's office filed electronically at 9 a.m. yesterday. My guy at the courthouse sends alerts for family names. Matteo picked up one of the coffees. She's been thorough, Dante. The filing references 6 accounts I didn't know she had access to. She got them from the Bellini processing records. Matteo was quiet for a moment. That's my fault. It's nobody's fault right now. Tell me about Cross. Matteo rubbed the side of his jaw. He had the same face he'd had at 30 roughly, just with more architecture, the lines deeper, the eyes a little more careful. He'd always been the one who told Dante the truth when nobody else would, not because he was braver, but because he'd long since concluded that the consequences of telling Dante a comfortable lie were always worse than the consequences of the truth. Cross doesn't lose, Matteo said, not because she's the best, though she might be, because she prepares like she's already in the deposition when she's still writing the retainer agreement. If Isabella gave her 6 weeks, she has your shell structure. She has the offshore sequence through Cayman. She probably has the property schedule in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island property is clean. The Rhode Island property is registered to a holding company whose parent entity is registered to another holding company that Carmine Esposito's name appears on in a 2018 amendment. Matteo said it the way a surgeon says the bad news. Precisely, no editorializing. Carmine is currently under a sealed indictment. The room was quiet. You knew this, Dante said. I flagged it in March. You told me to handle it after the Torino situation resolved. The Torino situation never resolved, I know. Dante leaned back in the chair. Outside, Manhattan moved at its regular indifferent pace, the sound of it always present, 20 stories down, like a river that doesn't care about the things happening on its banks. She won't use it against us, Dante said. Isabella isn't. She retained Vivian Cross, Dante. Matteo's voice was patient in the way that patience gets when it's costing something. Isabella isn't your enemy, I believe that. But Cross is Cross's client. Once those documents are in that office, Cross decides what to do with them, and she has professional obligations to her client that supersede anything Isabella personally wants to hold back. Dante picked up the page with the Cayman reference. Looked at it. How much time do we have, he said. Weeks. Maybe less if Cross is aggressive about the scheduling. The Rhode Island problem. I'll need access to the Esposito amendment. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. Dante set the page down. And I need a full inventory of anything Isabella could have accessed through the household accounts, the business expense records, and the Bellini processing files. Everything. I want to know what Cross already has before she tells me. Matteo nodded, starting to stand. Matteo, he stopped. Did you know about Celeste? Matteo looked at him across the desk for a moment. 7 months, roughly. The number landed specifically. 7 months. The same length of time Isabella had been pregnant. Dante picked up the second coffee and turned it in his hands without drinking it. Why didn't you tell me, he said. Matteo was quiet for long enough that the quiet itself was the beginning of the answer. Because the last time I got between you and something you were doing, you didn't speak to me for 4 months, and we nearly lost the Calabrese contract. He paused. And because I thought it would end on its own. You thought wrong. Matteo picked up his coat. I did. Celeste Varela called it noon. Dante almost didn't answer. He was standing in the doorway of the room. Isabella had converted into a nursery. Over the past 3 months, he hadn't been inside it before. Had passed the door without opening it, the way he passed most things in the penthouse that reminded him the domestic life he'd half consented to was proceeding without his full participation. The room was small by penthouse standards. A crib against the far wall, pale wood, simple. A mobile hanging above it, little wooden figures, painted blue and cream. A rocking chair in the corner. A shelf with books already arranged on it, paperbacks and board books mixed together, because Isabella had read somewhere that children benefited from seeing books treated as ordinary objects rather than formal ones. On the shelf beside the books was a framed ultrasound photograph, 4 inches by 6 in a simple silver frame. The image was indistinct in the way all ultrasound images were gray and white and black, half abstract, but you could see the shape of a head, the curve of a spine, the suggestion of a hand. Dante's phone buzzed again, he answered. I've been trying to reach you since last night, Celeste said. Her voice had a specific quality, warm, practiced, the register she used when she was managing him, which he had known and dismissed for months, because the managing had suited him. I heard about Isabella, about the filing. Already, Dante said. Word travels. Dante, listen to me. How did you hear? Pause. Shorter than it should have been. Through Raphael. Contacts at Raphael Petro. We have mutual friends, it's not. You have mutual friends with the son of a man I put in the ground 12 years ago. Pause this time was longer. That's not what this is. Tell me what it is then. His voice was even, calm. The voice he used in rooms where he needed people to keep talking, because what they said when they thought he wasn't suspicious was always more useful than what they said when they knew he was. Raphael is just someone I know socially. It doesn't mean anything. She shifted into the softer register, the one that had worked on him reliably for 14 months. What matters right now is us. What matters is that Isabella is going to try to take everything you've built, and you need people who are actually on your side. Are you on my side, Celeste? Of course I am. I'll call you later, he said. He ended the call. Stood in the nursery doorway for another long moment, looking at the ultrasound photograph. Raphael Petro. He hadn't heard that name in years, had filed it in the category of concluded business. The past stayed past. Marco Petro had been a lieutenant in the Moretti organization for 11 years before Dante had determined that Marco's loyalty had a competing buyer. The conversation that followed had been brief. The consequences for Marco had not been. Raphael had been 19 at the time. Dante remembered him only as a peripheral figure, a young man with bad posture and his father's eyes, standing at the edge of a funeral he'd attended under Moretti protection, because Marco had, whatever his betrayals, been family. That had been 12 years ago. 12 years was enough time to grow something. Dante pulled his phone back out, dialed Matteo. I need everything you have on Raphael Petro, he said when Matteo picked up. Current location, current operation, current associations. And I need to know how long he's had contact with Celeste Varela. Silence on the other end. Then she told me herself. She didn't realize she was doing it. Dante turned away from the nursery. Get me the file by tonight. By evening, the penthouse had taken on the specific atmosphere of a place where something irreversible had happened. The Christmas tree was still lit. The presents were still under it. Nobody had touched anything. Isabella had spent most of the day in the master bedroom, with the door closed, and Dante had spent most of the day in the study, and they had crossed paths exactly once in the kitchen, at 3 in the afternoon, Isabella coming for water, Dante standing at the counter with a phone to his ear. She'd filled the glass. He'd covered the phone. Are you eating? He said. She'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't categorize. Yes, she said. She'd gone back to the bedroom. He'd gone back to the phone. At 7, Matteo sent the file. Dante read it at the desk with a glass of water he'd forgotten was water, and kept reaching for thinking it was scotch. Raphael Petro was 31 now. He'd spent 4 years in Milan after his father's death, then resurfaced in New York in 2021 with money whose origin was vague and connections, whose nature was clearer, 3 documented meetings with the Tavares organization, 2 with the remnants of the Calabrese family, 1 with a man named Solis whose criminal biography Dante could recite from memory because Solis had tried to move product through Moretti territory in 2022 and the resulting conversation had not ended pleasantly for Solis. Raphael was building something. He'd been building it quietly, which meant he was smarter than his father, or had better counsel. The Celeste connection went back 18 months. They'd met at an event legitimate, a gallery opening. The kind of thing that Dante had never attended, and that Celeste attended frequently, because Celeste moved between the visible city and the invisible one, with a fluency Dante had found attractive and should have found alarming. 18 months. 4 months before she'd entered Dante's life. He sat with that arithmetic for a long moment. She hadn't wandered into his orbit. She'd been placed in it. Every piece of information she'd gathered in 14 months, the location of the private meeting rooms, the names he'd mentioned, the logistical details he'd let slip in the careless way that men let things slip when they believe they're the most dangerous person in the room. Every piece of it had been intentional. Collection project, systematic patient. He'd been surveilled by a woman he thought was in love with him, and he hadn't noticed. And she had been doing it on behalf of a 20-year-old grievance that had grown up and learned how to dress itself properly. Phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, which on any normal night he would have let go to voicemail. I wondered how long it would take you, said a voice that was young, precise, and entirely too comfortable. She's not as subtle as she thinks she is she? Dante leaned back in the chair. Raphael, he said. Mr. Moretti. There was something in the way he said it, respectful on the surface, wearing something sharper underneath. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. You have a habit of starting things without finishing them, Dante said. Your father had the same problem. The silence that followed was short, but it had edges. My father, Raphael said carefully, was killed by a man he trusted. Tried to learn from that. What is it you want? I want what was taken. Still that same measured tone, like a man reading from a prepared statement he'd refined through many private rehearsals. 12 years of your organization running territory that belonged to my family. I want the acknowledgement. I want the restoration. And since you're currently in a position where your domestic situation is creating certain vulnerabilities, I thought this might be an efficient moment to have a direct conversation. You thought my wife leaving me was a good time to make demands. I thought, Raphael said, that a man whose financial records are about to become part of a contested divorce proceeding might be more flexible than usual. Dante was quiet. I'm going to tell you something, Raphael. He kept his voice the same as it always was, not louder, not colder. No performance of menace, because performance was for people who needed the threat to do the work their actual capability couldn't. The fact that you're calling me directly tonight means you think you have leverage. The fact that you think you have leverage means Celeste has given you a specific piece of information that you believe will function as protection. He paused. It won't. But I'll give you until the end of the week to understand that yourself, and then we'll finish this conversation differently. He ended the call, sat still for a moment. Then he went to the master bedroom and knocked on the door, actually knocked, which he hadn't done in years, had of simply opening it because the marriage had granted him a possessive familiarity with the space that he understood now had never actually been earned. What? Isabella said through the door. I need to talk to you. Not about the divorce, about something else. A pause. Now, yes, another pause. The sound of movement. The door opened. She was in a robe, one of the thick ones, and her hair was down. And she looked at him with an expression that had moved past the morning's careful control into something more tired, not weaker, but more honest in its exhaustion. What? She said again. Rafael Petro just called me, Dante said. He watched her face. She knew the name. He'd expected that Isabella knew more of his history than he'd ever formally told her, because Isabella paid attention and remembered things, and had been standing beside the architecture of the Moretti organization long enough to understand its foundations. Come inside, she said after a moment. You look terrible. It was the closest thing to kindness she'd offered him in 24 hours, and it was conditional and exhausted, and came with no implication of forgiveness, and Dante Moretti, who had spent his entire adult life engineering situations where every variable bent to his preference, walked through the door his wife held open for him and understood that the next several weeks were going to require something he had very little experience with. Not strategy, not control, honesty. They sat at the small table near the bedroom window, the one Isabella used for morning coffee, that still had a ring stain from a mug she'd set down in a hurry 6 months ago, and Dante told her most of it, not all of it. He kept Matteo's specific concerns about the Cayman structure out of it and the Rhode Island property, because those were problems he needed to solve before they became her problem. But he told her about Raphael. He told her about Celeste's connection to Raphael and the timeline. He told her what Celeste had likely been collecting, and for how long. Isabella listened without interrupting, which was something she'd always been good at, the particular skill of absorbing information without performing her reaction to it in real time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 14 months, she said, roughly. So she came to you specifically. She was placed. Yes. Isabella looked out the window. The city below had its Christmas lights visible from up here, the organized twinkling of Park Avenue's arrangements, red and white, stretching in the dark like a lit runway. And the affair itself, she said. Was that calculated, or both, probably? He said it because it was honest and because she deserved the honest version, even when it was the worse one. Does it matter? No, she said after a moment. Not really. She turned back from the window. What does he want? Territory acknowledgement, financial restoration. And he's using the divorce filing as leverage. Please cross his discovery process. Will expose the organization before I can neutralize him. Probably right about the timeline. He's right about the threat, Dante said. He's wrong about my options. Isabella looked at him. Something moved through her expression, not softening, not warmth, but a specific recalibration. The way a person adjusts their read of a situation when new information lands. You need the filing to slow down, she said. I need it to be a controlled problem instead of an uncontrolled one. And you need me to make that happen. The room was quiet enough that the city sound from below felt present. I'm not asking you to drop it, Dante said. I know. I heard what you said. She placed one hand flat on the table between them. The wedding ring was still there. He'd noticed it and then tried not to notice it. I need to think about what you're actually proposing, which is that I participate in managing your crisis before I finish ending your marriage. Put that way, it was exactly as absurd as it sounded. Yes, he said. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed back from the table and stood, one hand going to the small of her, back in the habitual gesture of the last trimester. Go sleep in the guest room, she said. I'll tell you my answer in the morning. Stood, Isabella. She waited. He had several things assembled in his head, that he might have said several articulate, carefully weighted versions of what a man is supposed to say when he has broken something irreplaceable and is standing in the wreckage understanding, for the first time, what it was actually worth. None of them came out. Good night, he said. She nodded once. Good night, Dante. He left the room. The guest suite was at the far end of the hall, past the nursery. He paused at the nursery door on his way just for a moment, just long enough to look again at the pale wood crib, the mobile with the small painted figures, the ultrasound photograph in the silver frame. Stood there for a long time. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep. The morning after Christmas came in gray and without ceremony, the kind of New York morning that doesn't bother with atmosphere, just cold light pressing through the windows and the distant sound of traffic moving below like the city had already decided to get on with it regardless of what had happened the night before. Dante was awake before 6. He hadn't slept more than 90 minutes, maybe less, and the guest suite had the specific quality of a room that had been prepared but not lived in, the sheets too crisp, the pillow arrangement too symmetrical. The faint smell of a candle someone had lit at some point to make the space feel welcoming without understanding that the problem with a space like this was not the smell. He sat on the edge of the bed in the half-dark and looked at his hands. 23 years of running the Moretti organization had given him a particular relationship with mornings. They were operational hours, the time when decisions made the night before either held up under daylight or didn't. He'd never had trouble distinguishing between the two. But this morning had too many problems running simultaneously, and they were the kind that didn't separate cleanly into categories. His marriage was legally ending. His mistress was an intelligence operation. A man with a 12-year grievance had his phone number and was moving pieces into position. And somewhere down the hall, his pregnant wife was deciding whether to help him or let him burn. He got up, dressed in what he'd worn the day before, because he hadn't thought to bring anything to the Giswick, and went to the kitchen. Isabella was already there. She was sitting at the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug, dressed, hair up, and she looked like she'd slept about as much as he had, which was to say not much, but with more dignity than he'd managed. She had a legal pad in front of her with handwriting on it, 3 lines visible from where he stood, and she turned it face down when he came in without making a production of doing so. Coffee's made, she said. He poured a cup. She watched him do it with the expression of someone cataloging small details for reasons she hadn't disclosed yet. I talked to Vivian last night, Isabella said. He turned. At midnight. She doesn't keep regular hours when a filing is active. Isabella lifted her mug. I told her there might be a timing adjustment, that I needed a few weeks before the discovery schedule was formalized. Dante kept his face still. She wasn't happy about it, Isabella continued. She's never happy when a client asks for a pause. She thinks it's the husband getting into the wife's head. She set the mug down. I told her my head was fine and that I needed 3 weeks. That's what you decided. That's part of what I decided. She met his eyes. The other part is conditions, he waited. First, she said, Matteo reports to me directly on anything Raphael related. Not through you, not summarized, not edited. I want the raw information. It's not first condition, she said. I'm not negotiating the order. Closed his mouth. Second, Celeste Varela has no contact with you, not phone, not intermediary, not anything for the duration of whatever this is. If you need her to believe the affair is still operational for tactical reasons, Matteo handles it. She'll notice the shift. She'll adapt. She's been adapting to your behavior for 14 months. Isabella turned the legal pad back over and looked at her own handwriting. Third, when this is over, when Raphael is finished and the organization is stable, you don't fight the settlement. You sign what Vivian has prepared, and you don't use the organization's resources to slow the process or complicate my access to what I'm entitled to. Kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a siren moved through the street below and faded. That's what you want, Dante said. That's what I require. She looked up. He drank his coffee. It was good. Isabella had always bought better coffee than he would have chosen for himself, one of the 10,000 small details of the life she'd built around him that he'd absorbed without attributing and would notice now only by their absence. You understand, he said carefully, that 3 weeks may not be enough. If Raphael moves faster, then we'll revisit. But I'm not giving Vivian an indefinite hold. She'll walk. Isabella picked up her pen, clicked it once. And I need her. Not for the organization, for Nico. He needs to grow up with a mother who fought for what she was owed, she said. It was said without heat as a statement of fact rather than an accusation, which made it worse somehow. even if he never knows the details, even if he never understands what the fight was. I need to know I did it. Dante set his cup down. All right, he said. All right to all three. All right to all three. She nodded once, made a note on the legal pad, turned it face down again. Matteo should come this afternoon, she said. I want to understand the Raphael situation in full before anything else moves. Matteo arrived at 2 o'clock. He came alone, which was how he usually came to the penthouse, one of the few places Dante operated without visible security, on the theory that the address was not publicly associated with him, and the building's internal systems were more sophisticated than anything a visible guard presence would add. He came in and saw Isabella at the dining table with a glass of water and the legal pad, and his expression did a specific thing, not surprise, exactly, but a rapid recalibration. The look of a man who has walked into a room, expecting one configuration, and found another. Mrs. Moretti, he said, Matteo. She gestured at the chair across from her. Down. Dante said you'd brief me directly. He looked at Dante. Dante gave him nothing, just a small movement of the head that meant, do it. Matteo sat. He had a leather folder with him, the battered one he'd used for 15 years, that Isabella had once offered to replace, and he'd declined because the disreputable appearance of it had, over time, become a kind of professional signature. He opened it. Rafael Petro, he said, 31. Currently operating out of a registered import business on the West Side wine and specialty foods, which is legitimate on the surface, and provides excellent cover for the financial architecture underneath. He pulled a page from the folder and set it on the table between them. He's been building for 4 years. The organization isn't large, maybe 30 direct associates, another 50, who've been offered provisional arrangements, pending something more formal. What's he waiting for to formalize? Isabella said. Matteo glanced at her. The glance was brief and professional and contained a flicker of something that might have been respect. Credibility event, he said. Something that demonstrates he can take territory from an established organization. The Moretti family specifically, given the history. And the divorce gives him the credibility event. The divorce gives him the window, Matteo said. If the financial records become part of a public proceeding, it creates the appearance of structural vulnerability. Other organizations start looking at whether the moment is right to press. Raphael uses that pressure to move first and claim the territory before anyone else does. Isabella looked at the page he'd set down. It was a network diagram, names and lines, the visual grammar of organizational mapping. Celeste, she said. We believe she's been relaying operational intelligence since approximately the start of the relationship. Location of the private meeting rooms, key personnel names, shipment routing patterns, as she could observe or infer them. How much does Raphael actually have? Matteo was quiet for a moment. Enough to be dangerous, he said. Not enough to be decisive. The problem is that the financial exposure from the divorce proceeding would give him the second piece. Isabella looked at Dante. He was standing near the window. Not sitting, couldn't make himself sit, had tried twice and given up, kept moving in the small way that was his version of agitation, when he couldn't do anything active about a problem yet. So the divorce is the detonator, she said. If it moves to full discovery, yes. And Celeste is the intelligence apparatus, was Dante said from the window. She doesn't know she's been identified. Isabella looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not softened, but sharpened in a different direction. You're going to use her, Isabella said. She's the line to Raphael. If we can control what she reports, you can feed him a picture of the organization that isn't accurate. Yes. Isabella put her pen down, sat back. You've done this before, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Dante said again. She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that's doing more internal processing than external acknowledgement. How good is she, operationally? Matteo answered. Better than we initially assessed. She's careful. She uses different communication methods. She doesn't stay on any channel long enough to establish a pattern. But she's emotionally invested, Isabella said. Matteo paused. In what sense? In Dante, Isabella looked at her husband across the room with an expression he couldn't read. Came in as an operative, but 14 months is a long time to maintain pure detachment. If she's actually developed feelings or something she's mistaking for feelings, that's a weakness. It's also a complication, Matteo said. If she believes the relationship is real, she'll be more protective of her position, more reactive to any signal that suggests it's ending, which means she's useful and volatile. Yes, Isabella picked up her pen, put it down, picked it up again. Matteo, she said, what happens if Raphael moves before we're ready? The room changed temperature, barely, by the specific degree that happens when a question has been asked that the person answering it has been hoping to avoid. And the organization has a territorial war on 2 fronts, Matteo said. Internal, because some of the peripheral associates will read the divorce situation as leadership instability and start calculating their options. And external, because Raphael has been making guarantees to the people he's been recruiting. And if he waits too long, they'll start to question whether he can deliver. How long before he stops waiting? My best estimate is 10 days. Isabella looked at her legal pad, made a note. Fine, she said. Tell me everything you know about the waterfront operations. The ones Raphael would consider the most valuable. Matteo looked at Dante. Dante gave him the nod again, and Matteo started talking. That evening, Dante's phone rang with a number he recognized, not Raphael this time, but a man named Victor Crane, who ran a largely legitimate security consulting firm that had, for the past 6 years, functioned as a buffer between the Moretti organization and a particular federal office that preferred to conduct its oversight at a distance. Crane didn't call unless there was something specific. You have a problem in the Southern District, Crane said when Dante answered. No preamble. Crane never did preamble, define. A sealed inquiry. Pre-indictment stage. Your name isn't in it yet, but the organization's financial structure is the shell sequence specifically. Crane's voice had the particular flatness of expensive professionalism. Someone gave them a blueprint, not the full picture, but enough for a formal inquiry to open. Dante moved to the far end of the study and kept his voice below the volume that would carry through the door. When did it open? 3 weeks ago. I just found out because my source is cautious, and it took him time to confirm the scope without flagging his access. Raphael, unknown. The inquiry is clean enough that it could be a direct tip, or it could be document-based, something submitted rather than stated. Celeste, Dante said. Crane was quiet. She's been collecting information, Dante said. Financial structure, operations, routing. If Raphael submitted documentation to the Southern District as a separate pressure play, then you've got a coordinated two-front problem, Crane said. Divorce discovery from one direction, federal inquiry from another, territorial move from the third. Compression strategy. You're meant to be dealing with all three simultaneously. Dante sat down in the desk chair. He looked at the wall in front of him, a painting Isabella had chosen, a large abstract, red and gray, that he'd never understood and had stopped looking at until now, when looking at it was what his eyes were doing while his mind ran the arithmetic. How contained is the inquiry, he said. 2 investigators assigned. If it stays contained, you have a month before it escalates. If they get additional material, it escalates faster, significantly, which means Celeste cannot submit anything further. That would help, Crane said carefully. Dante ended the call. He stayed in the chair for a moment. Then he went to find Matteo, who was still at the dining table with Isabella. The two of them working through a schematic of the waterfront properties that Isabella had requested, and Matteo was apparently providing with more thoroughness than Dante had expected. He stood in the doorway. Matteo. Both of them looked up. We have a Southern District inquiry. Pre-indictment. Financial structure. He said it clean. The way you say things when the information needs to land without interference. 3 weeks old. Raphael or Celeste submitted the initial documentation. Matteo's jaw tightened. Isabella's face went very still. 3 fronts, Matteo said. 3 fronts. Isabella looked down at the schematic on the table. Put her finger on a point near the edge. This warehouse, she said. The one at the end of Pier 40. It's registered to the Bellini processing entity? Indirectly, Matteo said. Raphael knows about it. It wasn't a question. Both men looked at her. Celeste spent 2 weeks asking Dante about his Christmas schedule, Isabella said. She looked up. I know because Maria told me she'd been calling frequently, and that Dante had mentioned a family event at a waterfront property. Her voice stayed level. I assumed at the time it was surveillance on our marriage. I think now it was logistical. She was identifying properties for the federal submission and for Raphael's targeting. Dante looked at Matteo. She's right, Matteo said quietly. Which means Raphael knows the pier, Dante said. Which means it's already compromised as a location, Isabella said. And if he knows it, and if he's planning a territorial move in 10 days, he'll go there, Dante said. The 3 of them were quiet. The city outside was doing its evening thing, the shift in traffic sound, the light changing through the windows, the specific quality of New York at 6 p. on the day after Christmas, when people are either exhausted or restless, and the streets can't decide. Then we need to decide, Matteo said, whether the pier becomes a liability or a trap. Isabella looked at Dante. He was looking at the schematic. Trap, he said. Celeste called again at 8. This time, Dante answered on the second ring, not the first, because answering on the first ring communicated urgency, and the posture he needed to project was ease. You didn't call back, she said. Long day. He moved to the window in the study, standing where the light from outside fell on him, in the way he sometimes used when he wanted his reflection available, a habit, a way of watching himself watch. "How are you? I'm worried about you." Her voice had moved into its most genuine register, or what passed for genuine, the warmth she turned on when she needed to reassure him she was still safe. "What Raphael said to you, I know it sounded. He called me directly," Dante said. "Did you know he was going to do that?" A pause. "No," she said. "He moves on his own timeline sometimes. I can't always—" She stopped. "Calibrated. I mean, he and I don't. He's not someone I can control." Caught herself. "Not fast enough. What I need right now," Dante said, filling the space before she could reroute, "is to know where things stand with the organization. I need to do a full accounting before the end of the year, all the properties, all the operational accounts. I'm having the files pulled together. I don't see what that has to do with." "It has to do with protecting both of us," he said. "The divorce discovery goes forward. I need the structure clean before Cross gets access. I'm consolidating some things, moving some assets." He paused exactly the right amount. "I'm going to need a few days at the pier property." Quiet, no visibility. He felt the quality of her attention shift. It was subtle, a breath held slightly too long before she responded, but he'd been listening for it. "Waterfront one," she said. "Yes. When?" "End of the week, probably. I'll know more by Thursday." Another pause. "All right. Is there anything you need me to do?" "Just stay available," he said. "I'll call you when I know the timing." He ended the call. Turned from the window. Isabella was standing in the doorway of the study. He hadn't heard her come down the hall. "She took it," Isabella said. "Yes, she'll tell him tonight, probably within the hour." Isabella moved into the study slowly and lowered herself into the chair across from the desk, the chair Matteo usually used, the one that had developed a slight forward lean from years of him sitting at the edge of it. She looked tired, not the tired that came from a bad night, but the accumulated kind, the kind that builds up over months of carrying something heavy without anyone noticing the weight. "After this is over," she said, not looking at him. "I know, I'm not saying it again. You don't have to." She looked at the ultrasound photograph that Dante had, without quite deciding to, brought from the nurseries that morning, and placed on the corner of his desk. She hadn't mentioned it when she'd seen it earlier, and he hadn't explained it, and it had sat there all day between them, like a third presence that neither of them addressed. "He's going to wonder when he's older," she said. "About all of this. You don't have to tell him." "I know I don't have to." She looked at the photograph for another moment. "I just think he will anyway. Children understand more than you think they do. They feel the shape of things even when they don't know the details." Dante didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that worked. "I need to lie down," she said, and pushed herself up from the chair with the careful effort of the last trimester. She was almost at the door when she stopped, didn't turn around. "Dante." "Yeah. If this goes wrong, if Raphael moves before you're ready, and it becomes something else, I need you to promise me that whatever happens to the organization, you get Nico out. Not the money, not the assets, him." The room was very quiet. "Nothing's going to happen to Nico," he said. "Promise me anyway." He looked at the back of her, the shape of her in the doorway, the silk of the robe, the dark of her hair against it, the fact of her pregnancy visible even from behind, and felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean word for. Only the understanding that whatever it was the most honest thing he'd felt in a very long time. "Promise," he said. She nodded once without turning and left. Dante stayed at the desk. He looked at the ultrasound photograph. He looked at the schematic of the pier, where in 5 days Raphael Petro was going to arrive, expecting to find a wounded empire, and find instead the man who'd been waiting for him. Pulled the phone out, dialed a number. "It's set," he said when the line connected. "Pier, end of the week. Make sure everyone's in position by Thursday night." He ended the call, put the phone on the desk, picked up the photograph. The thing about ultrasound images was that they didn't look like what they were. They looked like interference, like static, like the visual language of a signal that hadn't resolved yet into something legible. But if you looked long enough at the right part, you could find it. The curve of a spine, the shape of a hand, the rough geometry of a face that was still forming. Dante looked at it until he could find all three. Then he set it down carefully, straightened it so it faced the room at the same angle as before, and went to get whatever sleep he could manage before the week that was coming arrived and became something none of them could take back. Thursday arrived the way bad weeks always do, not with drama, but with the quiet accumulation of things that don't quite sit right, the specific texture of hours that feel like they're moving too fast in the wrong direction. Dante was up at 4:30, not because he'd set an alarm, because his body had decided sleep was a resource it couldn't justify spending anymore, and had been making that decision consistently since Christmas Eve in the way that bodies make decisions when the nervous system has been running hot for too long without resolution. He stood at the kitchen window with coffee he didn't taste and looked at the city in the dark, the grid of it, the lights, the geometry of a place that had never cared about any specific person's crisis and wasn't starting now. Matteo had confirmed the previous night that 3 of their most reliable men were already in position near the pier. 2 more would arrive Thursday evening in separate vehicles, staying at a location 3 blocks east that the organization used for exactly this kind of operational staging. The pier itself had been left deliberately unattended, no visible activity, lights off, the loading dock padlocked, in the way it was always padlocked when the property was supposedly idle. Everything looked abandoned. That was the point. 6. Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway in the same robe, same careful movements, same expression of a woman who had made her peace with something and was now operating inside that peace rather than examining it. She filled a glass of water, stood at the counter, didn't speak for a moment. Today, she said. Tonight, probably. Raphael won't move in daylight. She nodded, drank. Set the glass down. Matteo's people are ready. Yes. And Celeste believes you'll be at the pier. She passed the information last night. Crane's source confirmed the contact was made. Isabella looked at her water glass, turned it slightly on the counter without picking it up. What time does Matteo want you there? I'm not going until I know Raphael's in position. There's no reason to be early. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. What time? She said again. 8 o'clock. Assuming Raphael takes the bait the way we've modeled. She nodded once. I want Matteo to call me when it's over. Not you, Matteo. Isabella, I'll be here with Maria. She finally picked up the water glass. I'm not going anywhere. I just want to hear it from someone whose voice isn't going to try to manage me while it tells me. Dante didn't argue. Fine, he said. She went back to the bedroom. He stood in the kitchen until the coffee went cold. At 9 that morning, things started coming apart. It didn't announce itself. It rarely did. It came in the form of a single phone call from a number. Dante didn't recognize not the theatrical kind of unknown number, not a blocked call with intent behind it, but the mundane unknown of a new burner phone, which meant someone had gone to a bodega and purchased hardware for the specific purpose of saying something they didn't want traced. You need to pull your men from the pier, said a voice he didn't immediately recognize. Male, mid-30s maybe, with a specific flat effect that suggested either narcotics or a very deliberate performance of calm. Who is this? Someone who isn't interested in being identified. Pull your men. Give me a reason. A pause. Traffic in the background. Outdoor call? Moving probably a car. Raphael knows about the setup. Not the details, but he knows it's not clean. Someone told him. Dante's hand tightened on the phone. When? Last night. I don't know the source. Why are you telling me? Another pause, longer. Because the alternative is 3 of your men walking into something they don't know they're walking into. And I don't have any appetite for that. The line went dead. Dante stood with the phone in his hand for exactly 4 seconds. Then he called Matteo. Matteo picked up on the first ring. Someone burned the operation, Dante said. Raphael knows. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to carry its own weight. Unknown. I just got a call from an unidentified number. Someone on Raphael's periphery who didn't want casualties. When did Raphael find out? Last night, late. Which means after Celeste made her report. Matteo's breathing was audible. Not panic. Matteo didn't panic, hadn't in 30 years, but the specific quality of breathing that happens when a man is running rapid calculations through a system he's built for exactly this kind of speed. Celeste told him about the pier, Matteo said slowly. And then someone else told him the pier was a trap. Yes, which means we have 2 separate people feeding Raphael. The sentence landed like a structural problem, the kind where you pull one brick and suddenly understand the whole wall was wrong. Matteo. Dante's voice was very even. Who knew about the setup? The full setup. Not just the pier, the positioning, the timing, the Thursday schedule. You, me, the 5 men in position, a pause, and Isabella. Isabella didn't, I know she didn't. Matteo said it quickly. I'm not suggesting Isabella. I'm accounting for who had the information. One of our men. Or someone who had access to one of them. Pull everyone, Dante said. Right now. Get them out of position and to the safe location on canal. Nobody near the pier. Done. Matteo was already moving. Dante could hear it. The shift in ambient sound. A door. What are you going to do about Raphael? He's going to expect the pier to be empty now. He'll assume we pulled back. Dante moved to the study window, looking at the street below without seeing it, which means he'll do one of 2 things. He'll either walk away entirely and we're back to a stalemate, or he'll move against a different target because his people expect action and he can't afford to appear paralyzed. Which target? The accounts, Dante said. If he has the financial documentation from Celeste and the inquiry is already open in the Southern District, the next logical move is to force the divorce discovery on an accelerated timeline. Put pressure on Isabella's attorney to move faster. Cross goes to full discovery before we've cleaned the structure. The inquiry becomes an indictment within weeks. Matteo was quiet for a moment. Dante, he said. The second source. The one who burned the setup to Raphael. That's someone close. I know, I mean very close. The positioning schedule was not widely distributed. I drafted it myself and gave it to the 5 men individually. I know what it means, Matteo. A pause. What do you want me to do? Find out which of the 5 has a connection to Raphael's network. Don't confront anyone. Don't move on anyone. I just need to know who it is. And then I'll decide. He ended the call. Dude at the window. The internal betrayal was the problem that changed everything else, not because it was unexpected, because it wasn't. Betrayal being a constant in the kind of organization he ran, present in every structure, at some level the way water was present in every wall, finding the cracks, patient. The problem was that an internal betrayal, at this specific moment, when the operation was already compressed by the divorce timeline and the federal inquiry, meant that Raphael had not just the intelligence Celeste was providing but a live view into Dante's tactical responses. Whatever he planned next, someone would know. Whatever move he made, Raphael would see it coming. Picked up his phone, dialed a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. It rang 7 times before it answered. I was wondering, said the voice on the other end, rough and old and entirely unhurried, when you were going to call. Dante said, Enzo Castellano, 74 years old, former senior advisor to 2 generations of Moretti leadership, before Dante had taken full control, at which point Enzo had removed himself from active involvement with the graceful efficiency of a man who understood when a new administration had no use for the old one. He lived now in a house in Westchester that his wife had chosen 30 years ago, and that he would leave feet first and not before. He was also the only man alive who had known Marco Petro as well as Dante had. Raphael Petro is making a move, Dante said. I heard. You heard. I hear a great many things in Westchester, Dante. Quiet up here and sound carries. No humor in it, just the flat statement of a man who had ears in places that hadn't changed in decades, because the people in those places had loyalty that predated current organizational politics. He's been building for 4 years. You should have addressed it 2 years ago. I know, but you didn't, because the file on Marco was closed in your mind, and you don't reopen closed files. A pause, which is a good quality for a lot of things, and a dangerous one for this. I need to know who in my organization has been in contact with his people. Enzo was quiet, long enough that Dante counted seconds. The name that keeps appearing in conversations I've overheard, Enzo said finally, is Caruso. Dante went very still. Sal Caruso, one of the 5 men positioned at the pier. 20 years with the organization had come up through the Bellini operation when he was 19, had earned his position through a combination of competence and consistent loyalty that Dante had never questioned, had been part of the inner operational circle for 11 years. 20 years. Are you certain, Dante said? Certain enough to tell you, Enzo said. Not certain enough to testify. A pause. He has a cousin, Mira Caruso. She works events catering, hospitality. She worked 3 functions that Raphael Petro attended in the past 18 months. Circumstantial. Yes, but then Sal was at the Thursday briefing, and Raphael knows about the Thursday setup. You do the arithmetic. Dante did the arithmetic. Enzo, he said. Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you. The old man's voice was even. I did it because Marco Petro was a traitor who got what traitors get, and his son is not going to succeed in rewriting that story by tearing apart something that other people, better people than Marco, spent their lives building. The line went quiet. Dante understood that the conversation was over. He lowered the phone. Sal Caruso, 11 years. The man had been at the hospital when Dante's father died, had stood in the rain at the funeral, had sat in rooms where decisions were made that would never be discussed outside those rooms, had been trusted with logistics, names, timing, the operational backbone of a dozen sensitive situations. And he had, at some point in the last 18 months, made a different calculation. Matteo called back at 11. It's Caruso, he said. The words were flat, no introduction, no lead-in, just the delivery of a conclusion he'd reached through a different route than Enzo and arrived at the same place. I pulled his communication records through our monitor on the operational phones. There are gaps periods where the phone was clearly off, but the pattern of the gaps corresponds to known Raphael contact windows. I know, Dante said, a pause. Enzo, yes. Matteo breathed out through his nose. All right, a moment. What do you want to do? Where is he now? Canal Safe House, with the others. I pulled all 5 like you asked. I need him separated from the other 4 without him knowing why. Can you do that? I can send him on an errand, something that looks routine. Do it. And Matteo, nobody else in that building knows why. We don't know who else might be compromised. Understood. Another pause. Dante. If Caruso has been feeding Raphael for 18 months, he may know things beyond the pier setup. He may have given Raphael the federal inquiry documentation directly, not Celeste. The thought had already been in the room. Dante had been sitting next to it for the last hour, without wanting to look at it directly. I know, he said, which means Celeste may be secondary. Raphael's primary intelligence source inside the organization was Caruso, and Celeste was a redundancy, or an independent operation that Raphael ran in parallel to verify what Caruso was giving him. Matteo's voice was careful now, picking words the way you pick footing on unstable ground. He's thorough, Dante. He's been more thorough than his father ever was. His father was greedy and impatient. That's what killed him. And the son watched that happen at 19 years old and spent 12 years deciding not to make the same mistakes. A pause. I think we've underestimated him. Dante looked at the desk, the ultrasound photograph in the silver frame. Get Caruso separated, he said. I'll be there in an hour. The safe house on Canal was a floor above a restaurant supply business that had been operating, legitimately, for 20 years. The smell of commercial cleaning products and industrial cookware drifted up through the floorboards in a way that had always struck Dante as somehow clarifying the smell of a place built for function, not impression. He arrived to find Matteo waiting in the stairwell. Matteo's face was the face of a man who had been delivering bad news for a long time and had never entirely made peace with it. He's in the back room, Matteo said quietly. I told him there was a protocol issue with the documentation from the Rhode Island property, and he needed to wait while I pulled the files. How did he take it? Find no tells. Matteo paused, which is itself a tell. A man who's been doing this for 20 years doesn't show anything when you put him in a room for a routine reason. He's been trained not to. Dante moved past him toward the back. The room was small, a table, 3 chairs, a window with the blind down. Sal Caruso was sitting with his arms on the table in front of him, relaxed in the careful way that people are relaxed when they've decided in advance to appear relaxed. He was 52, built wide across the shoulders, with a face that had never been what you'd call expressive, not cold exactly, but contained, the kind of face that gave away the minimum. He looked up when Dante came in. Something moved across his features and was gone before it became identifiable. Dante sat across from him, set his phone on the table between them, face down, said nothing for a moment. Caruso waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things Dante had always valued in him. How long, Dante said. Caruso's expression didn't change. I don't know what you're, Sal. Dante's voice was patient and completely without warmth. I know about the cousin. I know about the communication gaps. I know about the peer information getting to Raphael before Thursday. He paused. I'm not asking whether, I'm asking how long. Silence. Caruso looked at the table. The radiator in the corner ticked. 14 months, he said. Dante absorbed this. Before Celeste, he said. Yes, Raphael approached you. Mira introduced us. I didn't know who he was at first. Caruso's voice was even not the evenness of someone who didn't care, but the evenness of someone who had decided that the truth, delivered plainly, was the last dignity available to him. When I figured it out, I should have come to you. But you didn't. No. Why? Caruso looked up. His eyes were direct, steady, in the way that people's eyes get when they've passed through shame into something on the other side of it. Because he told me things about how Marco Petro died, Caruso said. And some of them I already knew. And some of them I didn't know but recognized as true when I heard them. A pause. Marco was my father's oldest friend. I was at his wedding. I held Raphael at the christening. The room was very quiet. You knew Marco, Dante said. I knew Marco before I knew you. Caruso's jaw moved. I know what he did. I know he turned. I know the organization's position on what happened. I'm not here to argue that he was innocent. His hands, which had been still, moved slightly, a small, controlled movement, like a man keeping himself from something. But he was family to me, and when Raphael came to me and said he just wanted to understand what happened, to have someone who was there tell him the truth, he stopped. I should have said no, but you didn't, but I didn't. Dante looked at him for a long time. Caruso met it. The federal inquiry, Dante said. The documentation submitted to the Southern District. I gave Raphael the account structure, Caruso said. Not the full sequence, what I had access to, which was enough. And the peer. You gave him the setup, I gave him what I knew. Caruso's voice was steady. I didn't give him everything. Some things I kept back. Why a pause? Because I didn't want anyone dead. I wanted the organization weakened enough that Raphael could negotiate from a position of strength, not destroyed. Not he stopped. I didn't want what's happening. Dante looked at him. At the face of a man he'd trusted for 20 years, who had been carrying this other loyalties inside the first one. The way a fracture lives in stone invisible until the pressure is right. What did you think was going to happen, Sal? Dante said. Not with anger, with something more like exhaustion. He's not negotiating. He never was. He wants the territory. He wants the organization. He wants the acknowledgement that his father's death was wrong, and the only way to get it is to take everything I have. Caruso was quiet. I know, he said finally. I figured that out around month 6. He looked at the table. By then I'd given him too much to go back. Dante stood up. Caruso didn't move. Matteo is going to come in, Dante said. And you're going to tell him everything you gave Raphael. Every detail, every document, every conversation. All of it. He paused. And then we're going to figure out what's salvageable. And after, Caruso said. Dante looked at him. What happens to me after, Caruso said. Question was asked without fear. Which was the question's answer about the man that he was asking not to negotiate but to know, because he had always been the kind of person who needed to understand the full accounting before he could sit still inside it. I don't know yet, Dante said. He left the room. Matteo was in the hallway. Dante looked at him and said he gave them the account structure. The federal documentation came from inside, not from Celeste. Matteo closed his eyes for half a second. How much? Enough to sustain the inquiry if they get anything additional. Which means Celeste may be trying to submit supplemental material we don't know about yet. Can have her phone monitored. It won't be the phone she uses for Raphael. Dante moved toward the outer room. We need to reach Crane and find out if the Southern District has received anything in the last 48 hours. If Raphael submitted a second package after hearing about the pier, then the inquiry escalates before we can respond. Yes. They were in the main room now, the two of them standing near the window that looked out over Canal Street. The ordinary traffic below, moving with the complete indifference of people who had somewhere to be and were going there. Matteo's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face did something. What? Dante said. Matteo turned the phone toward him. A text from their contact at the building registry. Brief, just an address and a timestamp. A new filing, 3 hours old, on the Pier 40 property. Not a purchase, a claim. A formal legal challenge to the ownership documentation referencing the Cayman holding structure and the Esposito amendment that Matteo had been trying to clean up for weeks. Filed by a legal entity whose registered representative, when Dante looked it up on Matteo's phone in the next 90 seconds, was an attorney named Dolores Vance, whose practice Dante did not recognize. He searched the name, found her in 30 seconds. Dolores Vance maintained an office in Lower Manhattan. Her professional biography listed 10 years of civil litigation and property law. Her client roster was not public, but her office address was 3 blocks from the building where Rafael Petro's import business was registered. He's not waiting for the pier anymore, Dante said. No, he's going directly at the property structure. If he can establish a legal challenge to the Pier 40 ownership, it gives the Southern District a second angle of approach. Not just the financial sequence, but the property documentation. Which means the inquiry becomes two-pronged, Matteo said. Financial and property. At that point, it's not a pre-indictment inquiry anymore. How long before it converts? Matteo didn't answer immediately. He was doing the arithmetic himself, the same calculation Dante was running, and reaching the same endpoint. A week, Matteo said. Maybe less. Dante looked at the phone. Filing. At the address of the attorney, who was 3 blocks from Raphael's registered business. He thought about Caruso in the back room. Telling him 14 months. Telling him I should have said no. Telling him I figured it out around month 6 too late. Too slow. Already committed to a thing he couldn't walk back from. He thought about Isabella at the kitchen counter that morning, turning the water glass slightly, without picking it up, asking what time. He thought about the ultrasound photograph. He put the phone down on the table, and he understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only when every option has been removed, that the version of himself that managed situations from a careful remove that planned, positioned, staged, controlled the variables while staying back from the fire was not going to be sufficient for what was coming next. Whatever happened in the next week was going to require him to be in the room. Not orchestrating it, in it. He picked up his phone. Called Isabella. She answered on the 3rd ring. The operation failed, he said. We have a second problem. The pier filing, the federal inquiry, and someone inside the organization. He said it plainly, the way she'd asked him to no management, no careful editorial decisions about what she needed to hear. I need you to call Vivian Cross tonight and tell her the pause is over. Silence on the other end. Dante, I need the discovery process to move. Aggressively. I need Raphael to believe the divorce is going forward full speed because I'm going to use that to pull him into the open. His voice was level, but there was something under it, something stripped of the usual control, and it occurred to him that she could probably hear it. And I need you to trust me on the next part, even though I haven't given you many reasons to trust me on anything. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Tell me the next part, she said. The silence that followed was long enough that he could hear her breathing slow, deliberate. The breathing of a woman who was measuring something against something else and hadn't finished yet. This doesn't work, she said. I know. No, she said. Let me finish. If this doesn't work, I need you to understand that I will have put myself and our son inside a situation that I agreed to enter because I believed you could resolve it. And if you can't, then everything that follows is on you in a way that can't be undone or restructured or financially compensated. Her voice was steady and entirely without drama. I'm not saying this to threaten you. I'm saying it because I think you need someone to say it plainly. You're right, he said. Another pause. I'll call Vivian tonight, Isabella said. And the last bridge between where they were and where there was no going back. Isabella called Vivian Cross at 9:17 that evening. Dante sat in the study and listened to the one side of the conversation he could hear through the half-open door, Isabella's voice, measured and direct, telling Cross the pause was over, that she wanted the discovery schedule formalized, that she wanted it aggressive. Cross asked something, Isabella said yes. Cross asked something else. Isabella said she understood the implications and she was prepared to proceed. Call lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Isabella came to the study doorway and stood there with the phone against her thigh. She's filing the discovery motion tomorrow morning, Isabella said. Good. She's also filing a motion to freeze certain assets pending the proceeding. It was already prepared. She had it ready the day I retained her. Isabella's expression was neutral in the way that takes effort to maintain. She said it was standard practice. I believe her. It will still look from the outside, like I'm going for everything. That's what we need it to look like. I know. Isabella looked at him for a moment. Dante, Caruso. He had told her about Caruso during the same call he'd told her about the pier and the filing all of it, the way she'd asked, without editorial. She'd been quiet through the Caruso part in a different way than she'd been quiet through the rest of it. What about him? Dante said. He's been with you 20 years. And he gave Raphael information that could end the organization. And you're not, she stopped, chose different words. What are you going to do with him? Dante looked at the desk. He's going to help us close this. He has specific information about Raphael's operation that we can use to verify what we're feeding through Celeste. After that, he paused. After that, I don't know. Isabella looked at him steadily. You could have him do worse things. You have before, I know. I'm not asking you to. She pushed off the doorframe. I'm noting that you're not. That's different than it used to be. She went to bed. Dante stayed at the desk. He didn't know if she was right. He wasn't sure what he was doing with Caruso was mercy, or just strategy that happened to look like mercy, and he'd learned enough about himself in the last week to understand that he wasn't always the most reliable narrator of his own intentions. He stayed at the desk until midnight. Then he started making calls. The next 4 days had a specific compressed quality, the feeling of a clock running in a room where the clock is the only sound, and everything else is waiting. Vivian Cross filed the discovery motion at 9 Friday morning. By noon, the financial press had picked it up, not the details, just the fact of it, the Moretti name attached to an aggressive divorce, proceeding with significant asset implications. By Friday evening, 3 separate conversations in 3 separate rooms across the city had been triggered by that information, all of them involving people who tracked the Moretti organization's stability, the way a ship's crew watches the horizon during weather. Matteo reported the first tremor. Saturday morning, one of the peripheral associate groups had asked for a meeting to discuss their arrangement, which was the organizational equivalent of calling your bank to ask about your account balance. Technically innocent, structurally alarming. Tell them the meeting can happen in 2 weeks, Dante said, calmly, not dismissively. 2 weeks, if Raphael moves before 2 weeks. I know. Tell them 2 weeks. The second tremor came Sunday. A property adjacent to the Moretti-associated restaurant on the west side had been purchased by a shell company that Matteo traced in 4 hours to the same network as Dolores Vance's law office. It wasn't aggressive, just a purchase, just a building next door, but it was the kind of move that meant someone was positioning to To have leverage in the physical geography of a neighborhood the way you had leverage in a legal proceeding. Raphael was tightening. He hadn't moved overtly. He wasn't going to until he believed the moment was exactly right, until the divorce proceeding had created enough visible chaos in the Moretti structure that the move looked less like aggression and more like the natural filling of a vacuum. Dante understood this because it was what he would have done. Monday he went to see Enzo Castellano. He drove himself no driver, no security, just the car and the Westchester Expressway in the gray January light, the road mostly empty, the city receding behind him into the specific muted quality of a winter skyline. The drive was 40 minutes. He used it to go through what he knew in the precise inventory-style thinking that had served him for 23 years, what he had, what Raphael had, what the gap between them was, and how to close it. The gap was closing on him, not the other way. That had to change tonight. Enzo's house was a colonial on a quiet street, the kind of house that had been modified so many times over 30 years that it had lost its original character and acquired a different one, more comfortable, more layered, the accumulation of a life rather than the statement of one. Enzo's wife, Carmela, answered the door and led Dante to the back sitting room without ceremony, which meant Enzo had told her he was coming and had also told her why, because Carmela Castellano had been decoding the subtext of her husband's professional life for 40 years and did not miss much. Enzo was in a chair by the window with the newspaper folded in his lap that he clearly hadn't been reading. He looked at Dante the way old men look at people they've watched, make predictable mistakes not unkindly, but without the pretense of surprise. "Sit down," he said. Dante sat. "Tell me what you need," Enzo said. "I need to know where Raphael is going to be Wednesday night." Enzo looked at him. "Why Wednesday?" "Because I'm going to accelerate the divorce timeline through Vivian Cross on Tuesday, with a specific financial disclosure that will look, to anyone watching, like I'm being forced to expose the most sensitive part of the organization's structure. It'll look like I'm cornered." He paused. "Raphael will read it as the moment. He's been waiting for the organization to show maximum vulnerability before he moves formally. If it looks like the proceeding is forcing a full disclosure of the account structure Wednesday morning, he'll want to be in position before that happens," Enzo said. "Because once the financial structure is in a court record, even a sealed one, the strategic value of moving against you diminishes. The damage is done. He needs to move before Wednesday morning, which means Tuesday night." Enzo was quiet. "You know where he'll be," Dante said. The old man looked at his unread newspaper, smoothed the fold with one hand. "There's a building on Vestry Street," Enzo said. "He uses the 4th floor. Not his business address, a separate space, registered to someone I believe is a cousin on his mother's side." He paused. "He meets his senior people there. Not the large group, just the 4 or 5 who know the full operation." "How do you know this?" "Because I've been paying attention to Rafael Petro for longer than you have," Enzo said simply. "Because when Marco died, I watched that boy at the funeral, and I knew that grief like that doesn't go anywhere. It just waits." He looked up. "I've been watching him wait for 12 years. Dante absorbed this. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you had it filed under concluded business, and when you file something there, you don't want to hear about it. I learned that a long time ago." Enzo picked up the newspaper, then set it back down. "I'm telling you now because it's no longer concluded. Vestry Street. Yes, he'll be there Tuesday evening, if he believes Wednesday is the exposure window." Dante stood. "Dante." Enzo's voice stopped him. "The building has 4 exits. He'll have people on all of them if he thinks it might be a trap. Can't go in with force, you'll lose 3 men before you get to the 2nd floor." "I know. Then how?" Dante looked at him. "He needs to think I'm coming to negotiate," he said. Enzo stared at him for a moment. "You're going to walk in there alone," the old man said. "Not exactly alone. That's extraordinarily stupid." "Yes," Dante said, "it is." He left. Tuesday came in cold, the first genuinely brutal day of the new year, the kind of cold that had teeth and used them. The wind off the Hudson, finding every gap in every layer and making itself known. At 7 in the morning, Vivian Cross filed an amended discovery disclosure, a real one, real documents, real account numbers, but a specific subset that Dante had identified with Matteo over the previous 48 hours as the section that would look most alarming to anyone reading it with Raphael's knowledge base, while actually containing nothing that couldn't be explained away in the proceeding itself. It was real damage, carefully calibrated, visible without being fatal. By 10, Crane confirmed that the Southern District had received a copy through channels. Someone in Raphael's network had a contact at the courthouse, faster than Dante had expected, which meant Raphael's infrastructure was more sophisticated than the 4-year timeline suggested. By noon, Matteo reported that two of Raphael's senior associates had been seen entering the Vestry Street building. Not all four, too. An advance check, probably. Someone going to confirm the space was secure before Raphael arrived. He's going, Matteo said. Tonight, yes. My read is 9 o'clock. Dante looked at his watch. It was 12:15. He had roughly 8 hours. He called Celeste. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been watching for his call, which meant Raphael had told her to be available. I need to see you, he said. Now, tonight, early 6 o'clock. There's a place on Hudson Street, the wine bar on the corner. Private back room. He kept his voice at the register she associated with vulnerability, not weakness, but the specific tone of a man who was cornered and reaching for the nearest thing that felt safe. He'd been using it on her for 2 weeks, and she'd been reading it exactly as intended. I need to talk to someone who isn't Matteo, of course. Her voice went warm the way it always did when he gave her access. Of course, I'll be there. He ended the call. Looked at Matteo across the room. She'll tell him immediately, Matteo said. She'll tell him I'm meeting her at 6. Distracted, emotional, Dante pulled his jacket on. He'll think I'm falling apart in real time. He'll think tonight is even better than he planned. And what's actually happening at 6? Celeste walks into the wine bar and finds you instead of me. He buttoned the jacket. And you tell her, calmly and without theatrics, that Dante Moretti knows exactly who she is, what she's been doing, and who she's been doing it for. And then you tell her that the choice she makes in the next 30 minutes determines what the next several years of her life look like. Matteo was quiet. She'll go to Raphael, he said. She might. Or she'll calculate that Raphael is about to be in a room with me and decide she'd rather have the option I'm offering than whatever Raphael gives her when this is over. Dante picked up his phone. Either way, she's not in a position to warn him effectively. She's in a wine bar on Hudson Street with you, and he's in a building on Vestry Street waiting for a man who doesn't negotiate. And where are you at 6? On my way to Vestry Street. Matteo stared at him. You're going in before he's settled, Matteo said slowly. Before his people are fully in position. Before the exits are covered. Dante, if you go in there at 6 and his advance people are already inside. 2 men. I can manage 2 men. You haven't managed 2 men physically in 15 years. Then it'll be educational. He moved toward the door. Have 3 of ours in vehicles on Vestry and on the cross street. Not at the building 2 blocks out. I call they move. Not before, and if you don't call. Dante looked at him. I'll call, he said. He left. The building on Vestry Street was unremarkable in the way that useful buildings always are: 5 stories, older brick, a ground-floor retail space that had turned over twice in the last decade and currently sat empty behind brown paper on the windows. The 4th-floor windows were dark from the street. The entrance was a standard door with a standard lock and a buzzer panel with 12 units. Dante stood half a block east and watched it for 20 minutes. He'd come without a driver. He'd come in a car he didn't usually use, parked 4 blocks over. He was wearing the coat he wore when he didn't want to look like himself, a dark one. Nothing distinctive. The kind that disappeared in a crowd. He saw one of Raphael's men cycle past the building at 5:40 a circuit, checking the perimeter. The man didn't look at Dante because Dante was a man in a coat standing near a building reading his phone, and there was nothing in that image that warranted attention. At 5:52, the man completed a second circuit and went inside. Dante crossed the street. The lobby door was unlocked. He'd expected that, because a locked lobby on a building with 6 of Raphael's people using the 4th floor was an inefficiency. He went through it quietly, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and moved up with the specific deliberateness of someone who has made their peace with what's at the top. The 4th floor hallway was dim. 1 overhead light, fluorescent, flickering slightly. 4 doors. The second from the end had light under it, and the muffled quality of 2 voices. Stood outside it, listened. 2 voices. The same 2 men who'd entered earlier. Speaking in low, routine tones, the sound of people doing operational preparation, checking equipment, running through logistics. Not alarmed, not expecting anything until 8. He opened the door. Both men looked up from the table. What happened in the next 45 seconds was not graceful. Dante had been honest with himself about the 15-year gap. His body remembered the mechanics but protested the execution, and the younger of the 2 men was fast enough to get 1 solid shot into his ribs before Dante had him down, and the older one caught the edge of the table on his way to the floor and made enough noise that Dante stood very still for 10 seconds afterward, listening for any sound from the floors above or below. Nothing, he breathed. His ribs hurt with the specific heat of a fresh impact that hadn't decided yet whether it was bruised or broken. He put his hand against his side and breathed again, and decided it was bruised. Probably. He moved both men to the back of the room. Used zip ties from his coat pocket. He'd thought about this, had been methodical about what he brought. Both men were conscious but not functional, and the older one was going to have a significant headache by morning. Dante straightened his coat, checked his phone. 5:59. He sent a single text to Matteo in position, stand by. Then he sat down in the chair at the head of the table that Raphael would use when he arrived, and he waited. At 8:11, the door opened. Raphael Petro walked in with two men behind him and stopped. The tableau he'd walked into was not the tableau he'd built in his head, the empty room, the operational setup, his people ready, the evening proceeding on schedule. What he found instead was Dante Moretti sitting at the head of his table in the dark, with two of Raphael's men zip-tied in the corner, and an expression on his face that suggested he'd been waiting long enough to get comfortable. Raphael didn't move for a full 2 seconds. Then his right hand went toward his jacket. "Don't," Dante said. The word was quiet. Not a shout, the kind of quiet that comes from certainty rather than volume. The register that Dante had spent 23 years perfecting. The sound of a man who doesn't need to perform threat because the threat is structural. Raphael's hand stopped. "Sit down," Dante said. Raphael Petro stood in the doorway of his own operational space and did the calculation that every person does in a room where they've just understood the situation is different than they prepared for, running the numbers on what was possible, what the risks were, what the man in the chair was likely to do with the different available options. He sat down. His two men stayed at the door. Dante clocked them, one at the frame, one half inside. Neither making a move because the man they worked for was between them and the problem, and they needed his direction before they acted. "Your men on the exits," Dante said. "Tell them to stand down. Not to leave, just to stand." Raphael looked at him. "I'm not here to end you," Dante said. "If I were, I'd have done it differently. Call them." Raphael pulled his phone, made a call, said 3 words in a low voice. "Put it away." "Good," Dante said. Raphael looked at him across the table with his father's eyes. Dante saw it now, the specific dark quality of them. The directness that Marco had had before the calculation in them had shifted. Raphael's eyes hadn't shifted yet. They were still the eyes of a man who believed in what he was doing, which made him more dangerous than a man who was only in it for money. "You're better than I expected," Dante said. "I should be," Raphael said. "I've been doing this longer than you know. 12 years. 13. I started the year before I came back to New York. Groundwork takes time." He said it without pride, just as fact. The way competent people discuss competent work. "Caruso," Dante said. Something moved in Raphael's face. "He told you. How much?" "Enough." Dante put his hands flat on the table. "Here's what I know, Raphael. You've built something real. 4 years of visible work on top of 9 years of groundwork. You have the Southern District Inquiry positioned. You have the property challenge on Pier 40. You have the divorce proceeding generating the financial exposure you need. You've been thorough and you've been patient, and your father..." He stopped. "Your father would have done it faster and worse, and you'd already be dead." Raphael's jaw tightened. "I'm not your father," he said. "That's the point. The point is what you did to him." "The point," Dante said evenly, "is that what I did to your father was a response to what your father did first. I know that's not how you've written the story. I understand why you haven't. But if you want to sit here and actually finish this conversation, instead of whatever you thought tonight was going to be, you need to be willing to hear the version that isn't the one Raphael Petro told himself for 13 years. The room was very still. One of Raphael's men at the door shifted his weight. The other one didn't move. "Your father was going to sell the location of 4 of my men to a rival organization," Dante said. "Names, addresses, family information. Not because he had a grievance. Because he was offered a specific amount of money and he took it." He kept his voice level. "I found out through a channel your father didn't know existed. I gave him the opportunity to explain himself. He didn't have an explanation that held up." He paused. "I know that's not the story you heard. What I heard," Raphael said, "was that he argued with you over territory, and you had him killed for it." "Who told you that?" "People who were there?" "People who weren't there," Dante said. "People who told you a version that made it a story about power and territory, because that story was actionable. You could build something on it. You could recruit on it. You could justify 13 years on it." He looked at Raphael steadily. "The true version doesn't have the same architecture. In the true version, your father made a decision that would have gotten 4 men killed, and I made a decision to stop him. That's not a story you can build a 12-year operation on." Raphael looked at the table. His hands were flat on it, the way Dante's were, both of them, with their hands visible, both of them in the posture of men who were talking instead of moving. "You expect me to believe that," Raphael said. "I don't expect anything," Dante said. I'm telling you because you're in a room where you should know all the relevant information before you decide what to do next. He paused. Caruso knew your father. He believed a version of the story that wasn't accurate because he needed to, because Marco was family to him. And family stories don't include the part where the person was going to get 4 men killed for money. That's not a failure of Caruso's character. That's just how people protect the people they love. Raphael was quiet for a long time. The fluorescent light overhead continued its faint flicker. What do you want? Raphael said finally. I want the Southern District Inquiry to stop receiving material from your network, Dante said. I want the property challenge on Pier 40 withdrawn. I want Celeste Varela to stop being a resource for anyone. He paused. In exchange, I'll acknowledge formally, through channels that matter in this city, that the territory your father held before 2012 was absorbed under circumstances that weren't clean, and that your organization has a legitimate historical claim to a portion of the West Side distribution arrangement. That's territory, he said, yes. You're offering me territory. I'm offering you what's actually yours, Dante said. Not what you could take if this went forward, which is nothing. Because if it goes forward, I stop managing it cleanly and start managing it the other way, and you lose people and I lose people, and the federal case destroys what's left for both of us. And the divorce, Raphael said, that's not your business. The financial exposure is being managed, Dante said. That's also not your business. Raphael looked at him. Why should I trust you, he said. You shouldn't, Dante said. Trust is not the correct framework. The correct framework is that I'm offering you something real, and the alternative is a war that neither of us can afford. And you're smart enough, which you've demonstrated to know the difference between a negotiation and a trap. And this is a negotiation. He reached into his coat. Raphael's 2 men at the door moved. Dante produced a single folded document and set it on the table. That's a draft, he said. Territory acknowledgement, historical claim, West Side distribution share. My signature is already on it. Mateo's is already on it. If your attorney reviews it tonight, and you see on countersign by tomorrow morning, the inquiry stops receiving material, the peer challenge is withdrawn, and Celeste becomes someone who used to work for you. Pushed it across the table. Raphael looked at it, didn't pick it up. And Caruso, he said. Dante held his gaze. Caruso made choices. He's dealing with the consequences. It's not part of this. Raphael reached out, picked up the document. Read it slowly, which meant he was actually reading it, rather than performing consideration, the specific focus of a man who'd spent years preparing for a moment that looked like this and was now inside it and making sure. The details matched what he'd been building toward. Dante watched him read. His ribs hurt. His hands were steady. The room was quiet except for the flicker of the light overhead and the distant sound of Vestry Street below, the ordinary traffic of a Tuesday night in January, people moving through the cold toward wherever they were going, carrying their own weights, their own arithmetic, the private negotiations of lives that had nothing to do with this room and its specific gravity. Raphael set the document down, looked at Dante. I need to make a call, he said. Make it, Dante said. Raphael stood, moved to the far side of the room, and made a call in a low voice that Dante didn't try to hear it was a lawyer. He could tell from the cadence, from the way Raphael was asking questions rather than giving instructions. It took 6 minutes. When Raphael came back to the table, his face had the expression of someone who had run the numbers and found them accurate. Picked up the document. I need one addition, he said. The acknowledgement needs to include the 2012 date explicitly, not a general historical reference the year. Dante thought about it. Done, he said. Raphael looked at him for a long moment. I'll have my attorney note the amendment and countersign by 8 tomorrow morning, he said. Dante nodded. He stood. His ribs made their opinion known again, and he absorbed it without showing it. He moved toward the door. Moretti. He stopped. Raphael was standing at the table with the document in his hand. My father, he said. The words came out carefully, each one placed. What you're saying is accurate. It is. Then he made a choice that put me in a position of building something on a wrong foundation for 13 years. The way he said, it was the voice of a man processing a thing that was too large to process all at once, and was doing it in the only increment available the words themselves. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, Dante said. He left the room, walked down 4 flights of stairs, came out onto Vestry Street into the cold, stood on the sidewalk and took a breath that made his ribs announce themselves sharply, and looked up at the building for a moment, and then pulled out his phone and sent Mateo a text. Done. Stand down. He put the phone away, started walking toward his car. 2 blocks east, a black SUV slowed alongside him, and the window came down, and Matteo looked out at him with the specific expression of a man who has been sitting in a vehicle on a cold street, waiting to find out if his oldest friend was alive. "You're limping," Matteo said. "I'm not limping. You're favoring your left side." "Get the door," Dante said. Matteo got the door. Dante got in. They sat for a moment in the warmth of the vehicle. "He's signing," Dante said. Matteo stared at him. 8 tomorrow morning, Dante said. Matteo stopped. Started again. "You negotiated a settlement with Rafael Petro in a building where you were alone with his people. 2 of his people. The others were on the exits. How are your ribs?" "Fine, Dante. Probably fine." He leaned his head back. "I need you to call Crane tonight. Tell him the inquiry documentation stops tomorrow. He needs to prepare to formally notify the Southern District that the submission was part of a civil dispute that has been resolved." "Can he do that?" "He's going to have to." He closed his eyes for a moment and called the peer attorney. "Dolores Vance. Have our attorney contact her tomorrow morning before 8. The challenge gets withdrawn as part of the agreement." "And Celeste." "Matteo called her at 6, Dante said. "I assume that conversation is done." "It is. She listened to every word, didn't argue, and asked what she needed to do." Matteo paused. "She was relieved, I think. She was in something she didn't fully understand when she got into it, and it had grown larger than she'd planned for. Most things do." The SUV moved into traffic. Dante looked out the window at the city going past the lights, the wet street, the ordinary movement of a Tuesday night that most of the people in it would remember as nothing, as just another evening, as the blank space between 2 events that actually mattered. He thought about Isabella at the penthouse. He thought about the nursery. He thought about a document signed at 8 in the morning, and what it would mean for everything that came after, not the resolution, not the tidy close of a chapter, but the opening of a different kind of accounting, the one that would start the morning, after the war was over, and the immediate problem was gone, and the only thing left in the room was what the 2 of them had been to each other, and what remained. "Take me home," he said. Matteo didn't ask which home. He drove toward the penthouse, and the city moved around them in its indifferent December way, and somewhere in a building on Vestry Street, a young man sat with a document in his hands, and the ruins of a 13-year story, and the document arrived at 8:03 the following morning. Matteo brought it in person, not sent, not scanned, physically carried it from the attorney's office on Worth Street to the penthouse, which was the kind of thing Matteo did when the thing being carried mattered enough to warrant the body attached to it. Dante was at the kitchen table when Matteo came in, coffee in front of him, untouched. He'd been sitting there since 6, not because there was anything to do, but because the penthouse had a different quality in the early morning, quieter, more honest about itself, less willing to pretend the walls didn't know what had happened inside them. Matteo set the document on the table, countersigned. Rafael Petro's signature at the bottom, next to the amendment in Dolores Vance's handwriting, the 2012 date. Explicit, Rafael had asked for it. Dante looked at it for a moment without picking it up. "Done," Matteo said. "Yes, Crane called at 7:15. The Southern District received a formal withdrawal of the submission materials this morning. His contact says the inquiry is being administratively closed, pending no further material. How long before it's fully off the books? 6 weeks to process. But practically speaking, it's done." Matteo sat down across from him. The peer challenge was withdrawn at 7:45. Dolores Vance filed the withdrawal herself, no commentary. Dante looked at the document again. Then he picked up his coffee, which had gone cold while he wasn't paying attention to it. "Where's Isabella?" Matteo said. "Still sleeping." Dante had checked. At 6 had stood outside the master bedroom door for a moment, not knocking, just listening for the quality of quiet that meant she was still asleep rather than awake and choosing not to speak. She was up late. She knows about last night. I called her from the car. Told her the basic shape of it. He set the coffee down. She didn't say much. "That's not always bad." "No," Dante said. "It's not always bad." Matteo sat with him for a while in the kitchen. The 2 of them quiet in the way that they'd been quiet together for 30 years. The specific silence of people who had been through enough together. That silence was its own form of communication, not empty, but full, packed with everything that didn't need to be said again, because it had already been said, or had been understood without saying, which was the same thing. "Caruso," Matteo said eventually. Dante looked at the document. "He gave us everything," Matteo said. "Every detail of what he'd passed to Rafael over 14 months. He sat in that room and went through it for 4 hours without a pause. A pause. Didn't hold anything back. I know you told me. I'm telling you again." Matteo's voice was careful. Because what you decide about him matters, and I want to make sure you're deciding it with full information, rather than the information you had when you were angry. Dante looked at him. I'm not angry, he said. You're something. I'm tired, Dante said. There's a difference. Matteo accepted this. He has a daughter, Matteo said. 14. Her mother died 3 years ago. Just the two of them. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city was coming into its morning, the particular sound shift of New York between 7 and 8, the texture changing as more of the population activated, as the street noise thickened and the lights strengthened, and the place became itself again, after the brief concession, to quiet that passed for night. Pull him from operational work, Dante said. Put him on the legitimate side, the restaurant supply, the management company, somewhere he's useful, but not in a position to cause structural damage. He paused. He stays on payroll, full rate. He doesn't get promoted and he doesn't get cut. And he knows why. He knows why. Matteo nodded once. And his daughter, Dante said. There's a private school on the east side that the Moretti Legal Fund has donated to for 8 years. Make sure her application goes to the right person. Matteo looked at him. Don't, Dante said, reading what was in his face. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something about how this isn't who I was 10 years ago. I was going to say, Matteo said carefully, that I think this is a good decision. Dante drank his cold coffee. Matteo left. Isabella came to the kitchen at 9. She moved through the doorway with the specific deliberateness of 8 months of pregnancy, one hand against the frame for the last step, and she looked at Dante at the table, and then at the document on the table, and she came and stood beside it and read it from where she stood without picking it up. When she'd read it, she straightened. Done, she said. Done. She went to the counter, poured water, stood with her back to him for a moment. Vivian called this morning, she said. Early, she'd heard through the court filing about the peer challenge being withdrawn. She wanted to know if there was something she wasn't being told. What did you tell her? I told her I'd call her this afternoon. Isabella turned around. She was wearing the thick robe again, and her hair was still down. And in the morning light, she looked the way people look when they've slept badly but deeply not rested, but through something. I'm going to tell her the 3 weeks weren't the pause. They were the end of the pause, meaning the discovery proceeds. Meaning the discovery proceeds. She looked at him steadily. When this was over. I'm not. She stopped. Adjusted. I want you to know I'm not doing this to hurt you. I know it probably doesn't help to hear that. But it's true. I know it's true, Dante said. She looked at the document on the table again. What was he like, she said, Raphael. Dante thought about it. Careful. More honest than I expected. He paused. Sad in a specific way. The kind of sad that's been organized into something productive for so long that he's almost lost track of what was under it. Isabella was quiet. What did you tell him? About his father? Truth. She looked at him. Was that the right decision? I don't know, Dante said. But it was the decision I made. He looked at his hands. He needed to know. Whether it changes anything for him, that's his. Not mine. Isabella set down her water glass. She came to the table and sat across from him, in the chair Matteo had used earlier, and looked at him across the width of the table, and the document between them, and everything else that had accumulated in the 2 weeks since Christmas Eve, which had the specific mass of years rather than days. Dante, she said. He looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it the way you answered questions last night, without managing me all right. Do you understand? She said slowly. Why I'm leaving. Not the affair, not Celeste, not the 14 months or the hotel or any specific incident. She looked at him steadily. The reason underneath all of that. He was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Because you never chose me, he said. She held his gaze. You chose the empire, he said. Every time. And I was part of the empire. I was the part that was supposed to run the domestic structure, manage the relationships, hold the legitimate face of the organization together. And you let me do that work because it was useful, and I think you cared about me. And I think in your way, he stopped. But you never chose me. When it came down to a decision, the organization was always first. Not because you're a bad person, because you built yourself to be that way, and you were very good at it. The room was quiet. Isabella looked at the table. Yes, she said. And you're leaving because Nico isn't going to grow up watching that, Dante said. You're leaving because you'd rather he grow up with parents who are honest about what they are to each other than with parents who are performing something. Yes, she looked up. Do you understand that the leaving isn't about punishing you? I'm starting to. It took you 2 weeks in a war. Yes, he said. It did. Something moved across her face, not a smile, but a relative of a smile. The kind of expression that exists at the intersection of grief and the involuntary recognition that something is accurate. You're different than you were on Christmas Eve, she said. I've had an educational December. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. You sat across from a man who had every reason to want you destroyed, and you told him the truth about his father. You made a decision about Caruso that isn't the decision you would have made 2 weeks ago. She paused. I'm not saying this to give you credit. I'm saying it because I want you to know I see it. Dante looked at her. It doesn't change what I need to do, she said. I know, but it matters. For Nico, how you are as his father is going to be shaped by who you're choosing to be right now. And that matters more to me than anything in the settlement. He looked at the document on the table, at the counter signature, at the amended clause with the year written in Dolores Vance's handwriting. I'll sign Vivian's papers, he said, whatever she has. I won't challenge the asset schedule. Isabella nodded. I know, she said. I believed you when you said it the first time. The signing happened 11 days later. Vivian Cross's office was on the 32nd floor of a building on Lexington, and it looked the way offices look when they're built, by someone who understands that the visual language of a space is itself an argument clean, expensive, deliberately understated, the kind of space that says I don't need to impress you because the work speaks. Dante came with his attorney, a man named Howard Parrish, who had been handling the Moretti organization's legitimate legal affairs for 18 years, and who had the specific quality of a person who has seen a great many things and has chosen, for professional reasons, to have no facial expressions about any of them. Isabella was already there when they arrived. She sat on the far side of the conference table with Vivian Cross, and she looked at Dante when he came in the way people look at each other, across significant distances, not coldly, not warmly, but with the attentiveness of people who understand that this particular moment is not a small one. Papers were 93 pages. Parrish had reviewed all of them. Dante had reviewed the specific pages that mattered: the asset schedule, the custody arrangement, the business interest division. Isabella received 3 of the Moretti organization's legitimate businesses: the property management company, the restaurant group, and the consulting firm. Combined value, enough to build from, enough to build well from. She received the penthouse, or a cash equivalent. She had chosen the cash. She received a comprehensive arrangement for Nico education, medical, a structure that Dante had asked Parrish to make as clean as possible, without conditions or leverage embedded in the language. He signed 93 pages. It took 22 minutes. When it was done, Cross collected the documents with the efficient professionalism of someone who had done this many times and understood that the ceremony of an ending was its own thing and didn't need elaboration. Parrish left. Cross left. The room was quiet, just the two of them, for the first time without the architecture of a crisis holding them in the same space. Isabella looked at the empty table where the papers had been. That's it, she said. That's it, Dante said. She looked at him. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and the wedding ring was gone, had been gone since the morning after Christmas. And he'd noticed it and filed it, where he filed things he couldn't do anything about. I'm moving to the apartment on Park in 2 weeks, she said. Maria's coming with me. Nico's room is already being set up. I know. Matteo told me the movers were scheduled. Of course he did. Something in her expression shifted, not the relative of a smile this time, but the full thing, brief and complicated and completely without malice. He's been managing both of us this whole time, hasn't he? He's a good man. Yes, Dante said. He is. She looked at her hands. When the baby comes, she said, I want you there. Not in the room necessarily. That depends on how I feel when the moment arrives. But in the building, he held her gaze. I'll be in the building. And after, I want him to know you. I want him to spend time with you. Not supervised, not structured, real time. She paused. That means you'll need to have a life that can hold him. Not the organization, not the work. A life that has room for a child in it. I'm working on that. Work faster, she said without heat. He nodded. She stood slowly, with the careful effort of 8 months, and gathered her coat from the back of the chair, and he stood across from her while she did it, and watched the ordinary movements of a woman putting on her coat, and understood that the ordinariness of it was the point, that the rest of their lives were going to be made of ordinary moments, like brief intersections, the exchange of the child between them, the logistics of a shared parenthood inside a finished marriage, and that the ordinary was not a lesser thing than the dramatic, but was in fact harder, requiring a different kind of endurance. Care of yourself, she said. You too. She moved toward the door. At the threshold she stopped and turned and looked at him one more time, the long look, the kind that takes an accounting of something. For what it's worth, she said, I think you could have been different. If things had been different, She paused. I don't mean that as a wound. I just think it's true. I think it's true too, he said. She nodded once and left. He stood in the conference room for a moment, with the empty table in front of him and the city visible through the window, gray and constant and entirely unconcerned, and breathed in and breathed out and let the moment be what it was. Nico Moretti was born on a Tuesday in February, at 4:17 in the afternoon at a hospital on the Upper East Side. He weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He had Isabella's eyes, or something that was going to become Isabella's eyes over the course of weeks, as the newborn blur resolved into features, and features resolved into a face. And he had a quality of alertness that struck everyone in the room, which was the quality newborns sometimes have when they arrive already paying attention, already taking inventory of the place they've landed. Dante was in the building. He was in the third-floor waiting area with Matteo, both of them in chairs that were designed for shorter visits, both of them in the specific state of men who are not good at waiting and are waiting anyway. When the nurse came to tell him, he stood up too fast and had to put a hand on the back of the chair for a second. Matteo said nothing about this. They went up to the room. Isabella was in the bed, with Nico against her chest, and she looked the way women look after birth, not composed, not photographable, real in the complete sense. The rawness of someone who has just been through something physical and enormous and come out the other side with a person they didn't have before. She looked at Dante when he came in. Come here, she said. He crossed the room. She shifted Nico carefully, the practiced already efficiency of a new mother settling into her own instincts, and held him out. Dante took him. Nico weighed almost nothing and everything simultaneously. Dante had held children before it held his sister's kids, had held the children of associates at various obligatory events, and the experience had always been the same, mildly awkward, brief, ceremonial. This was not that. This was something he didn't have a precedent for, a weight in his arms that was connected to him in a way that no territory, no organization, no empire had ever been, and the specific quality of it, the smallness of the face, the miniature hands, the sound of breathing that was just breathing, just the function of a body, figuring out how to be alive, came at him in a way he didn't see coming and couldn't have prepared for. He looked at Nico. Nico, eyes open, looked in the direction of his face with the unfocused intensity of the newly arrived. Dante stood there. He could hear Isabella breathing from the bed, could hear the hospital sounds outside the room, could hear Matteo somewhere behind him, quiet. He didn't trust his voice for a moment. He stood with his son and waited for his voice to come back. When it did, he said, very quietly, the thing that came out, instead of anything he would have planned. The room was quiet. Nico made a sound, not a cry, something smaller, the protest of a person who is still calibrating what sounds are for. Dante held him tighter by a fraction, the automatic instinct of arms that understood before the rest of him caught up. He stood there for a long time. The months that followed had the texture of renovation, the specific quality of something being rebuilt on an existing foundation, not from scratch, but with the understanding that the structure required changes that went deeper than cosmetic. Dante spent the first month after the divorce doing what he'd told Isabella he would do, clearing the most exposed operations, the ones that existed in the space between legal and illegal that had always been the organization's most profitable and most dangerous territory. It wasn't clean and it wasn't fast, and it cost money in the short term in the way that necessary restructuring always costs money in the short term. Matteo managed most of it. Dante managed the parts that required him. By March, the legitimate businesses, the management company, the restaurant group, the consulting operation that was now Isabella's were generating enough on their own that the restructuring wasn't collapse but compression, the organization becoming smaller and more defensible rather than larger and more exposed. By April, the Rhode Island property had been fully cleaned of the Esposito Amendment. The Cayman structure had been restructured through Howard Parrish's office into something that could survive a federal examination without catastrophic consequence, and the Southern District Inquiry was administratively closed. Rafael Petro's operation integrated the West Side distribution arrangement without incident. He was methodical about it, not aggressive, not theatrical, just the steady absorption of something he'd watered and was now managing. Dante heard about it through channels and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The agreement held because it was structured correctly, and because both parties had reasons to maintain it. Celeste Varela left New York in February. Dante didn't know where she went and didn't look for the information. She had made a decision and lived inside it for 14 months, and exited without the public drama that would have made her either a villain or a victim. She was just a person who had done something she couldn't entirely justify and had left the geography that made it visible. Caruso went to work at the management company's main office in Midtown. He answered phones and processed maintenance requests, and attended the kind of meetings that had nothing explosive in them, and by all reports from the building manager, he was reliable and quiet, and arrived on time. His daughter received a scholarship offer from the East Side School in April. Caruso called Dante to thank him. Dante said very little. There wasn't much to say, and the little there was didn't need to be said on the phone. He saw Isabella on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those were the days he had Nico in the mornings, for 4 hours, at Isabella's apartment on Park, while she worked from the second bedroom she'd converted into an office. Not because she needed to be present, but because Nico was still too young for anywhere else, and because the arrangement they'd built was still finding its form, and because practical proximity was the honest version of their coexistence. Dante sat on the floor of Isabella's living room with his son, and learned slowly and without natural aptitude how to be the kind of company a 3-month-old required, which was not the kind of company he'd ever been good at providing. Patient company, quiet company, the company of a person who had somewhere to be and stayed anyway, who turned off the phone and stayed on the floor and made the sounds that made the sounds stop, who learned, over the weeks, the specific pattern of what worked. Maria brought them coffee at 9:30 on Tuesdays. She set it on the end table near where Dante was sitting and said nothing, and went back to the kitchen. And Dante had learned that Maria's silence around him was not hostility, but something more complex, the judgment of a woman who had watched the household for years and had her own accounting of what had happened, and had decided that the accounting could be private as long as the child was cared for. He accepted this. One Thursday in April, Isabella came out of the office earlier than usual and stood in the doorway of the living room and watched Dante on the floor with Nico, who had discovered, in the preceding 2 weeks, that his own hands were objects of intense and renewable fascination. Dante was talking to him, not dramatically just talking, the low-running commentary he'd developed as a response to the discovery that Nico was calmer. When there was a voice present, any voice, as long as it was consistent. He was telling Nico, in a quiet and entirely unself-conscious voice, about the view from the penthouse balcony, about what the city looked like at 5 in the morning when everyone else was asleep, about the specific color of the East River in winter, which was a gray that wasn't quite gray, closer to the color of old pewter, the kind that had been handled for so long, it had a warmth to it despite the metal. Isabella stood in the doorway and listened. She didn't announce herself. Dante noticed her after a minute and stopped. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Don't stop," she said. "He likes it." Dante looked at Nico, who was studying his own left hand with the dedicated attention of a scientist, talking. By May, Dante had moved from the penthouse, not because anyone asked him to, because he'd stood on the balcony one evening, in late April, with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, and looked at the city and understood, without drama and without ceremony, that the life he'd built in that space was finished, not bad, not entirely wrong, but finished, and that staying in it was a way of avoiding the fact of the finish. He found a place in the West Village, smaller than anything he'd lived in since his 20s. Brownstone unit, ground floor, with a narrow garden in the back that had been maintained with moderate care, and was full of things he couldn't identify, because he'd never learned the names of plants, and it had never mattered until now, when he stood in the garden on a warm May morning with coffee that was still hot and thought, "I should learn what these are." He didn't learn what they were immediately, but he looked them up on his phone, standing in the garden, taking photographs and waiting for the identification app to tell him what he was growing next to. Hostas, bleeding heart, something the app identified with low confidence as a variety of hellebore. He read the entries. Hostas were shade-tolerant. Bleeding heart died back in summer. Hellebore was one of the few plants that flowered in winter. He stood in the garden with this information and thought about Nico, in 8 months old enough to notice the garden, old enough to be carried through it, old enough for the names of things to begin accumulating in him, the way names accumulated in children, effortlessly, like water filling a form. Put the phone away, went inside, made more coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the new apartment, which had the quality of a space that hadn't been lived in enough yet to know what it was going to be, and which felt, for that reason, like something possible. The evening Matteo came to the West Village apartment. It was late June. He brought a bottle of wine he'd been keeping for years, an actual good one, the kind that came out of the cellars, only when something was genuinely concluded. He set it on Dante's kitchen table without explanation and sat down. Dante found glasses. They sat across from each other at the table, the way they'd sat across from each other in 100 different rooms, over 30 years. But this room was new, and the wine was old, and the silence between them had a different quality than it used to, not the compressed silence of operational pressure, but the quieter kind, the silence of two men who had gotten to the other side of something and were sitting inside the proof of it. Matteo poured. They drank. The organization, Matteo said. What about it? It's stable. He said it the way he said things that mattered without wanting to overdress them. More stable in some ways than it's been in years. The exposure is down. The clean side is carrying more weight than it used to. A pause. Smaller. It should be smaller. Yes, Matteo turned his glass. I agree. I just want to name it because you worked 23 years to build what we had, and what we have now is different. And that's it costs something. Dante looked at his wine. Everything costs something, he said. The thing it bought, Dante paused. The thing it bought is worth more than what it cost. Matteo looked at him, said nothing, drank. They finished the bottle over 2 hours, talking about things that weren't the organization, and weren't the divorce, and weren't the December that had just finished reshaping both of their lives, talking about Matteo's youngest son, who had gotten into a program in architecture and was going to Rome in the fall, talking about a restaurant in the neighborhood that Dante had been to twice and thought Matteo would like, talking at one point about a trip they'd taken 25 years ago to the coast of Maine when the organization was young broke, and the two of them had driven north because Dante had read something about the water there and wanted to see it, and the water had been exactly what the thing he'd read had described, which was unusual enough to still be worth remembering. You should take Nico there, Matteo said, when he's older. Coast. Yeah, Dante said, he'll like the water. You can tell already kids who are going to like the water have a specific quality. What quality? They're not afraid of things they don't understand yet. They go toward them. Matteo refilled the last of the wine evenly between the two glasses. He has that. Dante thought about Nico's face on the floor of Isabella's living room. The way he studied his own hand with something that wasn't yet curiosity, but was the precursor to it, the fundamental orientation toward the world that would become curiosity once there was enough of him to have an orientation. Yeah, Dante said, he does. He stood on the balcony of the penthouse one last time in late June, the morning the moving company came for the remaining pieces. Not his things. Most of his things were already at the West Village apartment. The remaining pieces were the ones that had been Isabella's choices, the art, certain furniture, objects she'd selected, and placed over 8 years of building a home inside a marriage that was now concluded. Stood on the balcony while the movers worked inside and looked at the city the way he'd looked at it 1,000 mornings, the grid of it, the scope, the indifferent permanence of it, the way it absorbed everything and gave nothing back except the opportunity to try again. He'd stood here the morning of December 26th, in last night's clothes, with the divorce papers in his hand, trying to identify the correct move. He had not, on that morning, been able to identify it. He thought about that now, about the specific blindness of that moment, the way the problem had seemed to be Isabella's decision, when it was actually his own history, arriving in a shape he'd refused to recognize. A man could control an empire. He'd proven that. He could command loyalty, manage complexity, outthink opponents who had years of preparation and a legitimate grievance. But the city below him didn't care about any of that. It never had. It was the same city that had watched him build what he built, and had watched December happen, and would watch whatever came next with the same complete and honest indifference. The refusal to assign meaning that was, he'd come to understand, not cruelty but accuracy. The meaning was yours to make. That was the whole of it. A mover appeared in the balcony doorway. Sir, we're done inside. Last call if there's anything else. Dante looked at the city for another moment. No, he said. That's everything. He went inside. Walked through the empty penthouse, the marks on the walls where the art had been, the clean shapes on the floor where the furniture had stood, the nursery empty now, the crib gone, the mobile gone, the ultrasound photograph in the silver frame relocated to the apartment on Park, where Nico would grow up seeing it every morning, without understanding yet what it meant to be, the kind of love that outlasts the structure built around it. He walked through it once without lingering, took the elevator down, came out into the street. The city received him without comment. He walked east into the morning, toward the river that was the color of old pewter in winter, and something else entirely in June, and he walked with his hands in his pockets and his phone turned off, and the particular lightness that belongs to a man who has set down something heavy enough to have changed the shape of his shoulders and is learning, step by step, what it feels like to stand straight without it. He didn't have everything. He didn't have what he'd traded away, and he wouldn't get it back. And there were mornings ahead of him, many of them. He knew when the accounting of that loss would sit at the kitchen table with him, and refused to leave until he'd looked at it directly. But Tuesday was 2 days away, and on Tuesday he would sit on the floor of an apartment on Park Avenue with his son, and Nico would study his own hands with the focused attention of someone encountering the world for the first time. And Dante would talk to him about the river and the garden, and the names of things, and outside the window, the city would do what it always did, which was continue, which was the closest thing the world offered to permission. Kept walking. The river came into view between the buildings, the wide flat pewter of it, the light on it, the way it moved. Stopped, looked at it for a long time. Then he turned and walked back into the city. And the city took him in, and the morning continued, and that was enough.